Well, good morning, everyone. There are some new faces here, so I'll introduce myself again. I'm Jonathan Bourne, Chartered Town Planner. I've been appointed by the Secretary of State to hold this examination into the legal compliance and soundness of the Horsham District Local Plan 2023 to 2040. And the hearing sessions that are taking place this week are part of that examination. Now, before I go any further, am I too loud or too quiet? Can you all hear me all right? Okay. I'm going to turn to the council to deal with housekeeping points for those of you who weren't here yesterday. So can anybody help us on this? Sorry, looking the wrong way. Yeah.
That's fine. Good morning, sir. Thank you very much. Just a various set of so running through those. So fire safety, there are no fire drills planned today. If the fire alarms sound, please evacuate the building using the fire exits indicated and follow some of the officers outside the assembly points located beside the Wetherspoons pub until we can return to the office. Toilets are located on the landing by the stairs. And then just in terms of this room, when you are speaking, it's helpful to have the microphone directly in front of you. There were some reports yesterday that people sort of struggled to hear. And when you need to speak, please press the button in front of you and then turn it off when you are finished. There is no hot drinks or food to be consumed in the council chamber. Obviously, water is fine. If you have visitor passes, please make sure that's visible at all times. You can take it with you if you leave the building for a break or at lunch. But obviously, at the end of the day, please return that to you, to the council offices as you leave. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Powell. I think we are a bit loud, actually, getting a bit of feedback. Yeah? Good, all right. On the question of sound and noises, I can hear quite a lot of pings and buzzings and things. Can you make sure your mobile phones are off, please? All right. Right, we'll go through with introductions and Kerry Truman, who is Programme Officer, and you are also working with Ian. So if you've got any questions about the running of the examination, please speak to them. I'll go through the council's representatives now. Perhaps you could introduce yourselves.
Yes, good morning, sir. My name is Paul Shadarevian, KP, acting for the council.
Catherine Howe, Head of Strategic Planning.
Julia Hayes, Planning Policy Officer.
Tal Clayman, Principal Planner.
Matt Bates, Horsham Council Planning Policy Team Leader.
Thank you. And then we'll go to the second row and we'll work that way around.
Good morning, sir. My name is David Churchill. I'm from Carter Jonas and I'm representing Horsham Golf and Fitness.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Fenella Maitland-Smith. I'm a councillor at Rusper Parish Council and I'm chair of the Save Worcester Byfield campaign.
I'm George Sellers. I'm Chair of Planning on Rusper Parish Council, here representing the Parish Council.
Good morning, Sean Bashforth, the Quad, representing Our Place Sustainable Developments.
Councillor Fletcher, are you going to participate today?
No, but I'm Ruth Fletcher, the Cabinet Member for Planning and Infrastructure at Horsham.
Thank you. The row behind you, just that's the council, yes. All right. So go to Mr. James now.
Good morning, sir. Howell James from Nexus Planning, representing Crowdace.
Thank you, sir. Ryan Johnson, representing Highwood and their interests at Billingshurst. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. Mark Barrett from the Home Builders Federation.
And then we'll go to the next row and Ms. Piper.
Morning, sir. James Piper from Lucid Planning, representing Taylor Wimpey.
Kate Belfield from Vistry Homes.
Good morning, Katie Lamb from Stratton Parker. I'm wearing two hats today on behalf of Reside Holdings and Buchanan Trading.
Good morning, sir. It's Gemma Ackerman from Blue Fox Planning, representing Richborough.
Good morning. David Murray Cox on behalf of A2 Dominion. Good morning, Philip Allen of Boyat representing Waits Development.
Morning, sir. George Mackenzie, barrister from Landmark Chambers, representing Stacom Homes.
Morning, Sarah Buden from Savills, representing Preston Nicholson.
Morning, sir. Charlie Collins from Savills, also representing Crest Nicholson and Bowway Homes, interests east of Billingshurst.
Morning, sir. Adam Kindred, CBRE, representing Wayne Estates.
Thank you very much and welcome to you all. So I will do an abbreviated version of the opening I gave yesterday for those who weren't here. We're referring to the Horsham District Local Plan 2023 to 2040. It was submitted for examination on 26th of July 2024 and it's being examined under the September 2023 version of the framework. That includes the use of the standard method of calculating the housing requirement that was in place at the time. But it's important that we do have regard to the policies in the emerging framework. Since when that's adopted, its policies will form the development management framework within which planning applications will be decided. So the examination will look into the legal compliance and soundness of the plan. But as regards legal compliance, I consider that this has been fully evidenced, so I don't intend to hold hearings on any of those matters. As you know, paragraph 35 of the September 23 NPPF sets out the tests of soundness. I don't need to go through those. As far as the hearings are concerned, hearings are only really the tip of the iceberg. Much of the examination is conducted in writing. I've already had a lot of information, as you appreciate. So I simply want to focus on the matters that I want to hear more about. And as you probably know, I've sent comments on the plan's development management policies to the council already, which you can find on the website. So that explains why the hearing agendas won't include discussion on a number of the plan's policies. Now, you will be aware of the background to this examination, the issue of water neutrality, the fact that that issue has now been lifted and there's an opportunity to identify sufficient land to meet the district's housing needs and to accommodate an amount of unmet need from other authorities, which is likely to require the identification of additional housing sites. So this week's hearings are going to cover the headline housing matters, including the housing requirement, which we dealt with yesterday, housing supply, which we're going to deal with today, affordable housing and homes for special groups, and we're going to also look at business needs. So by the time we reach the end of these initial hearing sessions, the council should be clear on what modifications are required as regards the headline housing numbers. This will set the context for the council to identify and put forward additional housing sites and propose policy modifications. Now, I've got to make it clear that if additional housing allocations are needed, it'll be a matter for the council to identify those, not myself, to identify them and put them forward. So once the council's carried out the necessary work, they'll produce a draft schedule of main modifications, which will include any additional sites, as well as modifications to the plan's policies. These are modifications, they're changes that are necessary to make the plan sound. They will then be listed in a schedule and that will be subject to consultation, be on the website. Following the consultation, I'll consider the responses and if necessary, I'll hold further hearings, which might include spatial strategy, site selection, and a selection of the housing allocations, although I'll aim to deal with as much as I can in writing. As you know, I'm conducting the examination into the Mid Sussex local plan as well, and I'm holding a joint meeting with the two councils on Friday to help coordinate the work. And that will we'll look at the possible date for future hearings at that point. So in due course, I'll make a report to Horsham District Council, which will recommend main modifications required to make the plan sound. The council would normally adopt them. If it doesn't, the plan won't be sound and can't be adopted. Now, we dealt with the housing requirement yesterday. We left it open-ended at the end, which I'll come to in a minute. Today, I want to talk about housing supply, the ability of the council through the plan to maintain a rolling 5-year supply of housing land from the date of adoption. The issue of headroom, that is the theoretical housing supply above the housing requirement. Tomorrow we'll look at the ability of the plan to deliver homes for all the community, and we're looking at industrial and business needs. So in terms of today, for those of you who weren't here, it's quite difficult for me to see all the names 3 rows back. So if you want to speak, please hold your nameplate up. I'll give the, I'm going to, I'll come to this in a minute. I'll set the agenda. I'm going to group some of the agenda items that are under matter 2, which I'll come to in a minute. There's no need for anybody to give a formal presentation. You don't need to repeat your case in detail, just be focused. You don't need to repeat a point that somebody else has made. What you need to do is say what you want to say at the right time. And I'll terminate discussion on any particular matter when I've got enough information. I'll give the council the opportunity of summing up at the end of each topic item. And for those of you who perhaps haven't been to one of my examinations, I do give views and interim conclusions as we go through. And when I've finished, I will follow it up with a letter to the council. In terms of routine, we will have a coffee break at about, I don't know, 20 past 11, 11:30, an hour's lunch break about 1. If we're still going mid-afternoon, we'll have an afternoon tea break about 3:30. We won't go on any later than 5. I'd be very much surprised if we ever got there. Are there any questions at this stage about how the hearings will run? All right. Mr. Mackenzie.
So it's not so much a question, but just to circle back to something I think you said in your opening, which is that the plan was being examined under the the September 23 framework, which it is. I think, sir, you also said that it was being examined on the basis of the 2023 standard method-based local housing need. And you've got my submissions on this yesterday, but I just wanted to flag that we don't think that that's correct. I know that you gave Mr. Shadaravian an opportunity to come back on that yesterday. But if that does represent one of your interim findings, which you also said that you would be making during the course of the examination, I suppose it'd be helpful to know that.
Yes, I haven't seen anything that says that a plan that is being examined through the interim arrangements, which are set out in 2 MPPFs, should also be examined under a housing requirement that came out under in parallel with a subsequent MPPF. So I take your submission, and I've written it down, and I will give Mr. Shadaravian an opportunity again to respond to that if he wishes.
So I'm content to rely upon my submissions yesterday, and I align with your position on this.
All right. I have taken note of it. Thank you. So let's look at today's agenda. And what I want to do is group these because they are quite linked. So we'll start with 1A, which is the housing. It says the housing supply trajectory is proposed, but let's start picking up from yesterday's discussion on that very helpful table 3 that's in Council's document, which is HDC JB05. That's the matter 2 topic paper, which, yes, it uses a starting point in terms of housing requirement of the earlier version of the standard method. So again, Mr. Mackenzie, I appreciate that this is based on that and not on where you're coming from. But this is a supply table, not we were informed it was a supply table yesterday, but it does start at the top of the table by talking about housing need, and it comes to a figure of 14,071, and then an unmet need contribution of it says 3,757, but elsewhere I've seen that there's a different figure, it's 3,753 or something.
Sorry, sir, I'm struggling to find the table that you're referring to.
Right.
Is it the appendix?
It's in, I beg your pardon, yes, it's the bottom end of topic paper housing supply and headroom matter 2.
Yeah.
Right at the end, and I think it's also embodied in one of your trajectory tables as well. It's at the end of that, but I'm looking at table 3, housing requirement and growth options.
Yeah, sorry, so located
You've got it.
the table.
Yeah,
thank
all
you.
right, all right. I thought this would be a good starting point. So, picking up where we left off yesterday, well, before we do that, let me just go back a step. We'll do A first on the agenda. That's this, the numbers. Then we'll do B, C, and F. All right, which are housing delivery assumptions, reliability of assumptions about windfalls, and headroom resilience and the mitigation of risk. So we'll group those together. So, all right. Then we'll go on to D, E, and G. So D, E, and G are the robustness of the trajectory, maintaining an adequate housing land supply, and whether the housing requirements should be stepped. All right. And then we'll end up with H. So is that clear? Do you want me to go through it again?
It's clear for me, yes, sir.
All right. So A first, B, C, and F second, D, E, and G third, and H last. All right. It seems like a logical way through. All right. So going back to the supply trajectory and where we left off on yesterday, you have on your calculation a housing requirement of 17,828, which is made up of 14,071 and 3,757. I'm querying the 3,757 because I think there's an arithmetical mistake there.
Yeah, there is. It's essentially a rounding error, which wasn't picked up on, unfortunately, before we published the paper. But that's the Crawley unmet need, well, half the Crawley unmet need, 3,752. I mean, it's just where we then split it annually over the plan and then summed it. It's rounded to 3,757.
It's a ballpark figure anyway. We know where we're at. Yeah. All right. Okay. And then that gives you a requirement of 17,828, and then you've postulated 3 growth options. So now we're looking at the supply side. In other words, you're looking to test 3 options here. 17,800, which really gives you no headroom. A medium growth option of 19,300, which gives you 8% headroom according to your figures. And 20,100, which is a high growth option, which gives you 13% headroom according to your figures. However, yesterday, right at the end of yesterday, we were talking about potential for Horsham to accommodate some of the South Coast unmet need as well. And I think you committed to doing a piece of work which would look at potential migration movements and so on, Mr. Shadaravian.
That's correct, sir. I'm instructed that Mid Sussex are undertaking an exercise at the moment in order to assess what kind of contribution it could make to meeting South Coast needs. So I have advised my team that we should engage with Mid Sussex in order to see whether the methodology they're employing can assist us in determining the extent to which any functional relationship between the respective housing market areas can inform, in spatial terms, the location of any further dwellings to be allocated in order to assist in meeting that unmet need. Because quite clearly, there's no point in just allocating more houses if it's not going to assist in meeting that need. So we need to understand that functional relationship first and foremost. Common sense might dictate, for example, that those dwellings need to be found in the south of the district, having regard to communications, accessibility, and all those other factors. So we're going to engage with Mid Sussex. That meeting, as I understand it's to take place on Friday. And we are going to get on with that as soon as we possibly can. And on the basis of the available sites, assess what kind of contribution we can make at this stage, which you can take away, of course, and consider. So that's what we plan to do.
Okay, so in terms of timescale then, what are you...
I can't tell you today how long that process is going to take, and I wouldn't even venture to guess. I'm hoping it can be reasonably swift, and we will do our best to let you know what time period will apply to that exercise as soon as we have further information.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. We haven't got Mid Sussex here today, I don't think. The implication, and obviously I can't prejudge what would come out of that exercise, the implication is that your requirement is going to be hitting on your high growth option, leaving aside any headroom that you might require for resilience. That's the implication. As I say, I can't prejudge the outcome yet. But if you were notionally, and for example, contributions 50 DPA or 100 DPA are both, once you've added, let's say, a 10% resilience allowance in there, they're both hitting on or going above your high growth option. So just bear that as one to take away for the moment. Not hugely, I don't think, but they certainly would be up there. All right.
Well, that's a helpful indication, sir.
Yeah. Did you want to respond? You'd like to say you've got your finger on the button there, Ms. Hayes. No. Yeah.
No, thank you, sir. Thanks.
And I think that's all I want to say on A for the moment. But before we move on, is there anybody else who wants to talk to that first point? All right. Mr. Mackenzie.
Thank you. It's just to pick up on the point that Mr. Shadaravian made, which was an indication that a frankly very helpful piece of work is going to be carried out over the summer. And again, at risk of revisiting yesterday's matters, it's just to flag, sir, that the requirement in the framework is to meet unmet needs from neighbouring authorities. So the housing market area functionality is a consideration, and it's dealt with in the plan making section of PPG. But the requirement in the framework is to meet need arising from neighbouring areas, which goes significantly beyond just the housing market areas. Those are functional and practical tools, certainly, to have regard to when you think about where, as Mr. Shadaravian said, you might want to locate new strategic growth. But it's a red herring in the sense that that's not what the requirement in the framework is. The requirement in the framework in paragraph 11 and 23 is to meet unmet needs from neighbouring areas. And so that's not just the housing market areas, it's Ada, Mole Valley, Worthing, Brighton, etc., Chichester. So it's more extensive than the housing market areas. So.
Yes, that's right, and I don't disagree with that. But equally, there needs to be a mechanism to identify how those needs should be apportioned, and you have to have regard to the different timescales, the different local plans that have identified that need, You have to look at the ability of particular individual authorities to accommodate it. So there's a whole lot of caveats in there, but the basic principle I understand. Yeah. Do you want to come back on that?
Just one small point. The objective is to accommodate need, to meet that need. Allocating houses per se doesn't necessarily do that. It's important to understand those functional relationships as part of that very process.
Thank you, Mr. Shadrow, and that's what we're going to do. Any other points on? Yes, Ms. Piper.
So I'm not sure if it's part of this conversation or one about the splits, but I just wanted to highlight and agree with Mr. Mackenzie's point. In the Regulation 18 plan, pre-water neutrality, the council did look to consider draft allocations at that point in the south of the district of quite substantial size. So all I would say is that I'm not suggesting that that is the right strategy now, but what I am saying is that the consideration of numbers in the south were considered more appropriately. The split was more like a third, just over a third, or 40% of the total at that point. And I think that, you know, when we're looking at servicing and having sustainable development and locations for unmet need, that split needs to be looked at. I know you mentioned it yesterday that the spatial strategy is going to be considered, so I'm not sure if I'm preempting that discussion, but just to say Regulation 18 had two significant sites, which I don't think are any longer being promoted, but the idea of having development in the south was definitely considered back in 2020.
Thank you, Ms. Piper. So when we get to point H, we can talk a little bit about that. I don't want to, because this isn't a spatial strategy session, I don't want to preempt, because there might be other people who want to come along and talk to that. So I don't want to preempt anything that might happen in that discussion, but we can certainly touch on it when we talk about the identification of sites under point H. So I take that point. And in fact, I don't think there's anything between you and Mr. Shadrow in any way on this, because he's basically pointing in the same direction, that, you know, there is a spatial element to this. Mr. Mackenzie.
It's me again, I'm so sorry. So if we're going to move on from the low growth, medium growth and high growth pattern, which we've canvassed, there's just a point I wanted to raise, is that there's a slight, it may be that it's been resolved now, or it's going to be resolved, but there's an inconsistency between the way that those growth options are presented in the council response to ID 11 document. On page 4, the council say that a proportion of extra growth will be delivered through additional smaller scale allocations, but to meet housing need, the council will be required to allocate additional strategic sites. And that's the context in which the low, medium and high growth options are presented.
I'm going to stop you there. I'll tell you why, because we're going to talk about that in a bit.
I just
all right, yeah, no, we're going to come to that, yeah. All right, excellent. So let us move on to the next grouping, which is B, C and F. Now, there will be plenty of people, I think, who want to speak on this, but I'll just put out my thoughts on this. So these issues, which are about reliability of assumptions, any allowance for non-delivery, and windfalls, we'll come to that in a bit, and headroom. This is very, to a degree, in fact, very much in the hands of the council. So if the council are realistic about delivery, then the necessity for a substantial headroom resilience is reduced. But if there are manifest uncertainties about delivery, obviously it's important to have substantial supply headroom. So as I said, this is very much in the hands of the council. You have to be realistic about what can be achieved, your lead-in rates to your strategic sites in particular, any infrastructure impediments that might exist. These are all things that you have to be very, you have to be very level-headed about it. And there's really no point in being or trying to be optimistic in order to massage down what might be your overall housing supply because you're going to get, ultimately, it will trip you up, as it has done lots of local authorities. So you've got to make sure there's sufficient provision through allocations and appropriate policies. And for those who, this often gets misinterpreted. So it's often said, and I'm looking at you here. The council have over-provided. It's an oversupply. It's only a theoretical oversupply because almost always there are things that go wrong, things that get delayed, market changes, and so on. So it's actually not oversupply. It's simply contingency, and often that contingency gets used. So anyway, just going to say that the delivery is also related to other requirements in the plan, policy requirements. And I'm looking at you because you've been quite strong on affordable housing, and in particular on greenfield sites, non-strategic greenfield sites. We have got to look at the delivery side of this. It's important not to load up the list of requirements on individual sites such that they don't come forward, or such that they don't come forward at the rate that you think they're going to. At the moment, the market is under severe pressure, as we know. So we've got to have a deliverable plan here, one that works. And as far as windfalls are concerned, people might want to speak to that. I'd be looking at a very robust analysis. I know you have carried out analysis. It's got to be a robust time series, and it's got to call out any unusual factors that might have boosted windfalls in the past, because at the end of the day, you've got to be reliant. You've got to be able to rely on the figure that you put forward. That's all I'm going to say on that. Did you, the council, want to respond before I go and open the discussion?
No, I don't think there's anything particular that we want to say. I think the only thing I would just say is, I think broadly speaking, we're aligned with your views in terms of the issues that you've outlined, and really our position is that those are things that we have factored in, obviously as set out in our hearing statement, in terms of how we've sought to approach that in a realistic way, and obviously not get ourselves into trouble going forwards.
Thank you. All right. Now, does anybody want to speak? I've probably said too much. Mr. Mackenzie, you got your name please up. That's a legacy. No, it's not.
It's a legacy Toblerone, but I'm sure that I will have something to say about it.
All right. Let's go to Councillor Sallows first.
Yeah. Okay. The question mark about the proposed delivery assumptions, I think historically we have to assume that they're going to be accurate. So if the delivery is clear, if there's a real need exists and the allocations have been made as they are in the plan, then developers will build out to meet that need, and because it then becomes profitable for them. The only reason it would fail is if the need diminished. If the need diminished, then the demand for housing will fall off, and the developers won't build under those circumstances. So I think that it's fair to assume that with the allocations provided, if the market need is really there and there is a want, then it will be met. The developers won't sit on those if they're profitable to build out. So I think it's clear that any shortfall is going to be because of other external factors that have impacted the whole question of the need rather than the actual delivery.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting point in its own right, isn't it? Because in the short term, need and delivery don't necessarily match because there are a whole lot of other factors.
I think I think over the planned period, we must assume that if the build out isn't happening, it's because of the fact that it can't be delivered, as in the case of infrastructure. So things like the sewage works in Crawley need expanding. All of those things will be delaying factors on the delivery, or should be delaying factors on delivery. And they're rational ones that can't be overcome other than by sort of government intervention, really, at a very high level. So the delivery will happen, provided there is a demand and provided the land has been allocated. And we're seeing from this that the land has been allocated to meet the need, and it will be built out if all of the other infrastructure things can be met. So the delays, any delay is not because there is a lack of land supply, it's because, or allocations, it's because of a number of other factors will delay it.
Yeah, I mean, it could be short-term market factors as well. It could be mortgage rates. There's all sorts of things that have an influence over the ability to sell into a market at any particular time.
I quite agree, but allocating more sites will not influence that. So if Horsham is forced into a situation saying allocate 20% more sites,
I see your point.
Then it's not going to help. That doesn't help. If they've allocated enough sites, we know from historically and from market evidence that they will be built unless there are significant factors that stop them, and those significant factors would stop any other additional sites being built as well.
The trouble about that is that if you take that point, nobody would ever have a 5-year housing land supply problem, but they do. So, and these are because of delivery issues very often. So I'm going to park that and I'll go. Sorry, I can't see your nameplate. I should have. Ms. Maitland-Smith, that's right.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm actually going to make some comments, if I may, not with my campaigning hat on and not to necessarily try and push down numbers in any way, but just based on some comments that were made yesterday and my professional expertise in relation to forecasting and uncertainty. They will be brief comments. So the point I'd like to make, respectfully, of course, is that you consider placing only a limited weight on the high delivery achieved in Horsham between 2013 and 2020. And I'd like to explain in this case why the past is not necessarily a good guide to the future. So that was a special time, 2013 to 2020, and everybody knows that until 2012, financial markets and households were still constrained by the effects of the financial crisis. Of course, mortgage rates were still very low, but credit and lending was very, very tight, particularly for first-time buyers, and demand, therefore, for new housing was low. You mentioned demand, we talk about need, not necessarily the same thing. The authorities wanted to stimulate demand by taking on some of the credit risk themselves. And so the Treasury, I know you know this, but introduced the Help to Buy scheme, and the Bank of England, my former employer, launched funding for lending, both of which had the desired effect of loosening credit conditions and increasing demand, which in turn pushed prices up. Build-out rates responded, and hence the peak we see between 2013 and 2020. This is all explained in the Institute for Fiscal Studies recent report, and I think in the Home Builders Federation's response to that about the stimulus for building. I also discussed the relationship between local house prices, new supply and interest rates in my written statement for Matter 1. So it was the availability of credit due to these government schemes and the low interest rates at the time, which combined to provide a strong stimulus to demand. I'm not saying anything new, but as the CPRE point out in their written statement for Matter 2, conditions now and for the foreseeable future are completely different. I think you've already alluded to that, which is a view supported by highly respected housing market experts and commentators such as the FT's Neil Hudson. And yesterday, in fact, the FT reported a statement from Crest Nicholson, which coincided with earnings forecasts, macro uncertainty has increased with the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, contributing to the prospect of a more prolonged higher interest rate environment, renewed cost pressures, and a deterioration in consumer confidence. Seems to sum it all up. Nearly at the end, the government does, of course, have the option of introducing another stimulus package, but the now widely accepted effect of Help to Buy in reducing affordability, in fact, seems to be causing them to think twice. And so at the moment, that is not the reality we have in front of us. So to conclude, since the economic climate now and looking forward is completely different to that in the years around 2015, I would respectfully suggest that a low weight is attached to the likelihood of those high build rates being achieved in the near to medium term. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Of course, a number of things that you relate to are short to medium term fluctuations, but we do have a long-term trend in the house price to incomes ratio, very long-term trend upwards, which I think is what current policy is seeking to address. As I said to you yesterday, that is part of national policy, and therefore I'm looking at the plan in terms of soundness, and part of the soundness is whether it's in accordance with national policy. But I understand exactly. I read the same article as you, and you know, I did see, of course, that you know we've got plenty of house builder representatives here, but some of them have reduced their programs of land purchase in response to the current market conditions. That might change, but you know, when I was doing examinations around COVID time, people said, "Oh, the world is going to change completely, and you know, everybody's going to be working from home, and you need bigger homes, and you don't need workplaces." This stuff. You know, well, that's happened a little bit, but there's always a danger of reacting to short-term trends. We do know that there's a very long-term trend in terms of price to income ratio for homes, and also affordable homes, which we know about. So I see you've got your flag up again, Mr. Sellers, but I'm actually going to go to Mr. Murray Cox, who's been waiting a long time. So Mr. Murray Cox.
Thank you. More a suggestion, really, because it seems like this debate today about trajectory and assumptions and so on is probably the first conversation, and there's others to follow once we know where the requirement ends up and the sites as well. There's two statements, paragraph 14 and 15, and in today's topic paper from the council, where you get a couple of references to the fact that the council's been out and it's asked site promoters what it thinks about their delivery rates, and it says we've applied some sense check to this. Well, I've not seen that sense check, and I've not seen the information that we've had from promoters. So my suggestion would be that when we come back to revisit this topic, all participants, you, us and the council, has sight of that information, so that when we are looking at whether or not this is a robust trajectory, we have the same information in front of us.
I'll put that to the council. Did you want to respond to that?
Yes, thank you, sir. I suppose theoretically, there's no reason we can't make certain elements of information available. Some of it might be commercially sensitive, so I think that's something we'd have to sort of take away and pick up with the respondents. But perhaps that's a discussion to have with you and with other interested parties in terms of what would be useful to understand. I mean, we could provide copies of the information that we've sought.
I think it's quite common in examinations to provide, obviously you can't do commercial in confidence, but to provide an aggregate of or a summary of the information that the dialogues you've been having with developers, the information you've received from that, and the assumptions that have been built into that.
That would be very straightforward to pull together. Yeah.
All right. So if we can do that, what sort of timescale are we talking about?
Could we just confer during the next break and come back to you after that?
Of course.
Would that be okay?
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Berend.
Thank you, sir. I think in terms of the trajectory and Inspire, I'm not going to comment on specific sites or what they can or can't deliver. I think in terms of that, it's that uncertainty. I think when we talk about in terms of contingency, headroom, or however you want to look at it, in terms of if you've got large strategic sites coming forward, there's a complexity to delivering those. There's an uncertainty, which it's the unknown, sir, that we're trying to address in terms of that those trajectories, recognising that there is an ambition to ensuring those sites come forward as soon as possible. In terms of house builders need those sites to come forward in order to generate those, deliver those, and deliver homes and make the profits that they need to sustain themselves. So I think there is an ambition there, but there are uncertainties in terms of infrastructure and just in terms of delivery rates, in terms of market uncertainties that need to be taken into account. And I think that's where that contingency is necessary. And I think it's looking at it not just in terms of contingency often towards the end of the plan period, but contingency earlier on. I think what we have here, sir, is I think there's a number of sites, over 600, the strategic sites, that from 28-29 deliver about 50% of the housing need and their housing supplied. So we've quite a considerable amount coming from those sites, and any delay to those sites will potentially mean that you don't have the 5-year land supply moving forward. So it's how you ensure there's both, I suppose, certainty towards the end of this plan period, but certainty at the start of that plan period, especially given that there's been a significant level of undersupply due to the water neutrality. So it's how to ensure that those homes come forward as soon as possible, but also in ensuring that you provide that contingency in that early and midpoint of the plan, should there be any delays in terms of those strategic sites coming forward as to when and how they deliver in terms of their annual rates of delivery. So I think it's those issues that need to be addressed. I think what we don't have here, we have a supply on the basis of just the standard method level of delivery, the 819, not against the 819 plus Crawley plus anything for the south. For the South Coast authorities. So it's that position at which we need to look at and say, well, actually, is that supply a reasonable supply? Is that going to meet need? Does it have the contingency? And where is that contingency? And I suppose that's part of the council going away and looking at that supply and the types of site, is ensuring that there is a mix of sites coming forward that supplies that contingency, not only in terms of, say, an overall 10% contingency, but also in terms of the mix and type of sites and where those sites are coming forward. So you have that mix that provides a robust supply across the entire plan period. I think that's part of that work going forward, I think, is the important thing. And then, as we talked about yesterday, sir, in terms of how that then relates in terms of steps and how that might look in future, or whether there is a need for a step. But I think what the council should be looking at is as much as possible trying to ensure that consistent supply across that, which then provides that more robust trajectory, rather than, say, reliance on very large sites where you might have far more uncertainty. So it's about that mix of strategic and small, medium-sized sites across the piece, which we don't have in terms of the new supply, which obviously that's for the council to go away and do that piece of work. So I think that's where I would see it. I think in terms of what that contingency should be, it's very much a rule of thumb. You'd look at about 10% as a minimum in terms of ensuring that, but that will very much depend on the type of site you're expecting on that. So I think that's my position in terms of the contingency and the headroom. And it's very much about moving forward. I think you've also mentioned, so in a more robust assessment of windfall, I would agree in terms of that. I think in terms of the larger sites, there's clearly a lot of uncertainty. There's been a couple of years where it was over 100, where in some years it's 0. And I think that's set out in HO, is it HO9, I think is the topic paper on that. yes, and table 3 in HO9 sets out, yes, that in 2017, 18 and 2018, 19, there was the 100 large sites came forward, but it falls down to no sites on those large sites coming forward in 22, 23. So what you're seeing is quite a significant, and that's the on PDL sites. On greenfield, it's quite high. So there's a really sort of uncertain picture in terms of reliance on that. And I think you do see quite a number of plans come forward and say, well, actually not going to include those larger sites in terms of windfall because they're inherently uncertain, especially where you've had lots of PDL and office to resi conversions, which might have come forward. So that low-hanging fruit's almost been taken. And can you see that moving forward across the entirety of the plan period? You'd also expect a lot of those smaller sites to have been allocated as part of this local plan, or those, not small sites, but those PDL sites and larger windfall sites that you've seen in the past potentially have already been delivered or allocated in the local plan themselves, which seem far more certainty in terms of the small sites that would come forward rather than those large sites. So I think at the moment there is, I think they've included 120. I don't think that's necessarily a certainty across the plan period. So.
Thank you, Mr. Barron. You kind of preempted point H, so you don't need to say that all again under point H. But I want to have a talk about the mix. I'm becoming increasingly aware that this is really a preliminary discussion, isn't it? Because you will need to take these points away, come back with some figures, and we're going to now whether we do that in writing or how we do it, I don't know. Mr. Shadarivan.
It seems to me that this discussion, and I don't in any way put the blame on anybody here because it's inevitable. This discussion is about the robustness of the evidence and support of the allocations and the place which they occupy within the trajectory. So the question is going to be, once the council have identified additional sites, once the requirement has been set, is how we then interrogate the trajectory based on the position of those allocations within the trajectory and the evidence which supports delivery of those individual sites, having regard, for example, to the infrastructure delivery plan as well, because where infrastructure is needed, we need to build in sufficient headroom in terms of the delivery timing to accommodate the provision of that infrastructure. Now, all these things need to be interrogated. The question then is how best to do that. Do we go through each individual site, or do we take particular sites in order to test the overall methodology employed by the council in that regard? And that, sir, is something entirely for you, and we will assist you in whichever way we can.
Thank you, and I agree with that. It's a question not only of how we go about that interrogation, but also the timing of that in the process as well. Yeah. All right. Ms. Lamb.
Thank you very much. It was just a small point, as it's a rather hybrid point and does stray into H, which I know we'll speak about later. But the comments we've just been listening to come to the point that the council need to allocate a sufficient number of sites, but also a range and mix of sites, because whilst admirable, they have assumed that things will go as planned. And of course, things don't always go as planned. Sites don't necessarily always come forward. And of course, if you have a small pool of large strategic sites, that doesn't give you very much flexibility. And therefore, to do so and to have flexibility in the plan, you've got to increase supply, you've got to have an element for headroom, and you've got to have a mix of sites that can deliver both certainty in meeting housing needs across the whole plan period, but meeting those needs smoothly across the whole plan period without the need for a substantial step, which you can achieve if you have a mix of smaller and medium sites, and of course provide some robustness in the 5-year housing land supply, because if there is a risk in one of these larger strategic sites coming forward, there isn't enough headroom or resilience to fill that gap. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sallows.
I think that the purpose of this this session is to look at housing supply, but I think you mentioned earlier about the reliance on following the national planning policies, and it is important, but we have to also take account that those planning policies allow for a number of other factors, notably that the oversupply for housing isn't free. That land would have been used for something else. And those other things are also covered by policies. So increasing the housing supply doesn't just benefit housing; it is to the detriment of all the other factors of farming and the environment and our food supply chain. All of those factors are government policies equally that need to be considered. And I'm sure you're well aware of all of those, and many of them are covered within the NPPF itself. So. With other policies beyond. So I think it's important to keep that balance in place, that land isn't free, that if you over allocate for housing, you're taking that land away from other uses, other really important uses for both the environment and for the long-term health of the country.
Thank you, Mr. Sellers. I would make a point in relation to that, additional sites will be subject, you'll have to do a sustainability appraisal. So that will have to be done on the choice of additional sites. Mr. Collins.
Thank you, sir. I was not waving it around as well, so you can just about see me. Just a few brief points, and it's been touched on by a few of the other speakers as well. It might have been covered yesterday, but you'll be aware from our statement that, and also the council's evidence, that the council previously had high rates of housing delivery 5-10 years ago. One of the other speakers was attributing that to economic circumstances. Clearly that is a relevant consideration, but what is also relevant, sir, is positive plan making to a degree. 2006 core strategy in Horsham, 2015 local plan. They had for periods up-to-date local plans in this district. For one reason or another, probably water neutrality, that situation is obviously not the case today. But I would submit, sir, that planning contributed to that higher rate of housing delivery because a number of large strategic sites and other allocations were coming forward. So that's the first point. The second point was in respect of economic needs, clearly entirely relevant. The market's not great at the moment. I would submit, but a plan needs to be long-term and needs to be aspirational. That's clear from the present NPPF, but also the 2023 NPPF. So I would bear that in mind in terms of judgments on the trajectory and needs, because obviously housing needs aren't just an economic consideration, they're social as well. And then a further point was made by Mr. Murray Cox about developer information to the council. I can confirm on behalf of Crest Nicholson and Bowway we have provided trajectory information. In fact, we've even put it in our statement, so ours is public. And suffice to say, we've been slightly more ambitious than the council in their own trajectory that's been published. So that's there in our statement, sir. Clearly from our perspective, that can be made public as it already is. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. On that, just been thinking about this, obviously in relation to publicising or aggregating information about delivery on different sites, if you do it now, it's too early in the process because you're going to be identifying other sites, aren't you? So, yeah. So it will have to be done at some point, but the question is when, and then how do we go about interrogating it?
That's precisely the point I was making before.
Under D, E and G, I wanted to talk a bit more about the stepping of the housing requirement. Oh, Mr. Mackenzie.
So I've got three short points, context, windfall, and then a point about cake. But so we'd also echo the points made by Mr. Berrence and Ms. Lamb, and to paraphrase Warren Buffett, so the only free lunch in ensuring a robust housing supply is diversification. Got to have a mix of sites. So we absolutely echo that. But so the point about context is that the council's own figures at the moment show a shortfall of 2,000, just under 2,400 homes against their own requirement. And just to put that into context, so that is far below the level of supply previously identified in the Reg 19 plan, which identified a level of supply which was just under 19,900.
I think we've all moved on from that really now. So, you know, we've got the submitted plan, but I think there's general recognition that the figures in there, that's going to have to change, obviously. So the level of shortfall is going to be different.
Yes. The contextual point, obviously, is that the reason why the supply is lower now is not because of concerns about deliverability of those sites. It's because of the water neutrality, which has now been overcome. Okay. The point about windfall, sir, if I may, is that the council's evidence in relation to windfall from larger sites is based, obviously, as you'd expect, on previous rates of delivery. But those previous rates of delivery came forward in a policy world where there was a 35% requirement for affordable housing. That now proposing 45%, and we say that that doesn't, you can't then extrapolate delivery that came forward in a different policy world into the future. That wouldn't comprise the robust evidence that the framework requires for relying on windfall. It's a completely different policy framework. And so you referred in your opening or earlier today to market pressures, which everybody is aware of, and I don't think I need to say any more about that. But we've set out in our statement that we don't think that in that context, windfall from the larger sites can be relied upon, and that would be 45 units a year. That's windfall from the larger sites. And then, so the point about cake is having cake and eating it, which you can't do. And so it's the point about the headroom identified in the low, medium and growth, and it's not clear at the moment whether that is going to be headroom. Headroom is one thing, it responds, as you said, sir, to uncertainty, or whether it really is a component of need. And when I spoke earlier, I gave the reference to the council's response to your initial letter resuming this examination, sir, where those growth options are expressly said to be needs-based. If they're needs-based, they can't be headroom.
Yes, I think that was the point I made yesterday as well. But you know, we're talking about establishing need and then looking at what would be an appropriate amount of headroom, and that needs to be evidence-based, depending. So the council have committed to doing that extra piece of work, so we'll look at that. The affordable housing issue on non-strategic greenfield sites, I think is was that what you were referring to? 45% just now.
Yes, it's not 45%. It's 45 units a year of windfall are said by the council to be flowing from larger sites. So that's sites of 10 units or more, because those would attract the affordable housing at currently what's proposed at 45%. And they say that that's justified because windfall from larger sites has previously come forward at rates identified in the windfall paper, the windfall study. And so the point that we make is that those came forward in a different policy context, 35%.
That's helpful. I do want to explore that, and we have got an affordable housing session, but I want to flag up my concern about the racking up of the level of affordable housing on non-strategic greenfield sites for delivery reasons. I know that there is substantial evidence of a need for affordable housing, which you have evidenced in your topic papers and in your background material. There are two ways of delivering affordable housing. One is to have high rates of affordable housing requirement on individual sites. Another one is to actually deliver more homes generally by have larger housing provision. And I want to explore that. One of the factors potentially leading to a potentially higher housing requirement would be to bolster the supply of affordable housing. So if there's a very high affordable housing need, that would tend to suggest that you should be aiming at a higher housing delivery, higher housing requirement. So we've got a balance between delivery and affordable housing provision that's got to be got right. And I'm not, on the evidence yet, convinced that the levels that you're seeking, one issue is what you do with land west of Ifield, because there's a potential objection from Homes England on that, in terms of the level of affordable housing. And the second is this issue of greenfield non-strategic sites, which not only could affect windfalls, but also actually could affect delivery generally. And putting that out there, I'm not convinced the council are taking the right approach on this. We revisit affordable housing when it's an agenda item, which is tomorrow. Did you want to speak on this just now?
I think it would be premature, actually, to speak about it now. It's something which we are going to deal with tomorrow, and I think it's best dealt with in that session.
I do want to talk under this topic heading about the step trajectory. We've touched on it a little bit. With the best will in the world, and with the council bringing forward potentially some more short-term sites, and I want to talk about that in a minute, I can't see a situation where you cannot step the trajectory. I just can't see how that would work. And the question is, to me, whether you've struck the right balance in what you're suggesting. So you can't do anything but reflect what has been done already, and you can't do anything but what is going to come forward in the next couple of years. There is a kind of grey area after that, which is to do with whether you can ramp up, whether it's possible to ramp up supply in what, years 5, 6, 7, something like that. What year are we in now? Are we in year 4? Yeah. So it's going to be difficult year 4 to year 5, I suspect. But after that, but your step comes in. You've got 2 steps, haven't you? I think. Yeah.
Yes. So we've got the first 3 years, which we discussed yesterday. We've got the initial step 4 to 7. And then the second step up 8 till 17.
So what you need to do is to have it. I mean, I can only assume you've looked at that in terms of what would hit you in terms of the 5-year supply calculation, because if you're having to have accommodated 20% buffer and spread your unmet need over even over the planned period, I suppose the first 5 years, that's still quite a big overhang of a requirement, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and we've had in mind 5-year housing land supply and ensuring that there is potentially, depending on the sites that we end up on, a rolling 5-year housing land supply. So what's in Matter 2 in that topic paper reflects what we know about the submitted sites and what we know from the engagement we've had with those site promoters, and also a slightly sort of hypothetical view of what might happen year on year. But I think we've tried to make clear in the topic paper that it's an indicative step, and actually the work that we do on the additional sites will then feed back into a sort of iterative piece of work on that supply.
All right, this is extremely important to me, not least because not only you, but I also invest quite a lot in ensuring that plans go through to adoption and they're sound and they're robust. And what I absolutely don't want to see is my inspector colleagues suddenly finding you've not got a 5-year supply, you know, a couple of years down the line. So it's a really important thing, and I think I want you to take a very realistic and very level-headed approach to that, and come up with something that is actually going to work. Now, I'm going to move on to the next topic, but before I do, does anybody want to say anything about this step trajectory business? I think it's down to you ultimately to come up with something that works. I don't know whether what you've produced already needs to be looked at again. What's your view on that?
I think based on the outcome of yesterday's hearing, what we know about the need to go away and look again at unmet need, we anticipate there probably is some work to do on building resilience into the trajectory, but we absolutely agree we're in the same position as you. We have no interest in not having a 5-year housing land supply at any point, and we've been very cognizant of the need to be I can't think what the word is. To be realistic about what might come forward on those sites. There's other work around infrastructure, capacity in different areas of the district that will all feed into that. So we don't see what we've published as being the end point. But it really just reiterates that we do need that step, and possibly more than one step. That might be something that we go away and look at as well.
Good. Yeah, that's very helpful. We really can't go any further than that at this point. Let us move on then to that last point, which Mr. Barron's already preempted, which was about the mix of sites. And again, I think we can only really have a general discussion because we're in a position where you have to go away and do quite a bit of work. Depending on where we end up with the housing requirement and the percentage contingency, it looks to me like you will need to find not only sites to meet the high growth option, possibly beyond that as well. So with that in mind, there are a couple of things, aren't there? So first of all, there's the early years point. Yes, I think it's unavoidable that you have a step trajectory, possibly even 2 steps. But it would be good to try to mitigate that to some extent by getting some additional sites identified, which can help with shorter term delivery. And after all, you're going to be producing another plan. So we've got this first stage where these sites that you're going to be identifying are going to come in within the life of the plan that we're talking about today. All right. Then secondly, you're going to have to identify potentially more strategic sites for the longer term, and that will feed into this plan, but obviously it'll form a bedrock for your future plan. So it's very important to identify them now because of their long lead in time. On that point, I had a look at you very helpfully produced documents on the strategic sites you've looked at and the non-strategic. So you've got housing assessment outcomes, and you've got another document called sites not identified for potential allocation for housing development, which are on the website. I won't go into detail on them now, but my initial reaction was, again, on the strategic sites, that you've taken a blanket, this will harm the environment approach. Well, of course, if you're having to allocate sites for housing, they will affect the environment. It's a question of balancing that against impacts. When it comes to the smaller sites, the non-strategic sites, I thought there was a readiness to flag up red on a whole range of sites, or amber, on the basis of the landscape capacity study. And I know that these are common things, landscape capacity, but actually, you know, landscape isn't something that has capacity. Landscape has capacity. It's not as though it hasn't. It's got capacity. It's a question of balance again, whether a proposed site is going to cause harm that's going to outweigh the benefit. You've got to bear in mind that meeting housing need is a significant benefit. So it's a similar thing to there's no such thing as showstoppers because in the planning world everything is a balance. So there is a need to look again at how these things are evaluated, and particularly to take a critical approach to what is said in the landscape capacity study. All right, things can be mitigated. I mean, obviously you'll get some sites which are dreadful and there's nothing you can do about them, but there will be others which can be mitigated. You could take a landscape-led approach. You know, you can. There's a whole range of things. Same with the location of heritage assets. So you may have heritage assets nearby. It may be that you can mitigate impact. It may be that in the new world we're not going to be using the term less than substantial, but it may be that, you know, the impacts are less than substantial. So there's a whole range of things that need to be revisited. I know you're going to do that anyway. You've got you've done the basic work. Did you want to respond? Sorry, there's a little bit of a diatribe, that one. Sorry, I'm going to go to Mr. Johnson first. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, sir. I think you've covered everything I was going to say, and I appreciate the council have got to go away and do some further work on a range of sites. We agree that that is the right way forward, including strategic sites that could yield units in the first 5 year period, as well as small sites. So yes, we'll leave that to the council to proceed.
Thank you. And Mr. Murray Cox.
Thank you, sir. Just following on a point that I said yesterday and what you've just said now about there being no showstoppers. Of course, that is exactly what you said to Mid Sussex as well, about planning is essentially a series of judgments. The difference in Mid Sussex, of course, is that that session was before that authority went off and did its additional round of site assessment work. Here, my understanding of this is the council's already doing that. So it's doing that in a world where it believes there are showstoppers and that those apply. And I think it would be useful to have some sort of indication as to whether or not, in undertaking this site assessment work, it needs to revisit its methodology and apply your approach of there are no showstoppers. Because otherwise we're going to get to some point further down the line and I'm going to be back here saying, well, they've not applied this approach that you've said. They've applied a showstopper-based approach, and we're going to be having the same debate again.
Mr. Shadaravian.
We haven't come to any firm conclusions yet, and we're going to take the points you make firmly into account.
Yes, and Mid Sussex developed a methodology as well, which I'd commented on. So it's something that, you know, might be of interest to the council. Well, you'll be aware of it anyway, I'm sure. Yeah. Ms. Howe.
I think it's just, I think you're probably aware of this yourself, sir, but just to confirm, I think there may be some confusion in the room, but there's obviously been discussion around small sites, just to confirm that we are looking at that. That just doesn't necessarily seem to be picked up, and I just thought it'd be helpful to make that point clear.
I didn't doubt that you were, you know, I'm sure you are looking at that. The reason I mentioned it is because it helps with the earlier part of the trajectory, and it will have an influence on how you step that trajectory. Right, Mr. Mackenzie.
So it was just to flag that, albeit that you characterised your view as a diatribe, it is in fact firmly rooted in the framework itself, and in particular the last sentence of paragraph 32 of the September 2023 framework, which says that where significant adverse impacts are unavoidable, then the correct approach for plan making purposes is to then identify suitable mitigation measures or compensatory measures. And there's also the Leeds City Council case, which says that even where the framework says permission should be refused, it's still always ultimately a matter of evaluative planning, judgment and balance. And that approach applies also to plan making.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mr. Bashford, right, and I've noticed you, Mr. Bashford first.
Yes, thank you, sir. It's really a question to the council in terms of timing, because a lot of this, whether it's the trajectory or strategic sites and the kind of how they get delivered, is a lot of that work is being undertaken, but it does seem to me that that's the next stage of the examination rather than some form of interim step, because there will always be that uncertainty without that evidence base. So I'm not clear at the moment what the council are doing in the short term and what they're doing as part of the next stage, because it is unusual the way we're undertaking this examination in terms of looking at the numbers, but it is very difficult to kind of validate that at the moment, as you've alluded to. So that it's really that timing point I'm unclear on at the moment. So.
Yeah, we'll come back to that, Mr. Bashford, because it's something that's exercising me as well. So, Ms. Lamb.
Thank you very much. I've just got a few short points which I hope will be helpful. Firstly, it was really good to hear from the council that they are looking at smaller sites as well, because there, I think it was mentioned yesterday, and it is mentioned in their letter to you in February, that the growth options rely on strategic sites, 1, 2 or 3 to be delivered. So really pleased to hear, because I think we're all agreed in the room that a mix of sites is necessary for a number of reasons. In relation to how they find those sites, and I appreciate that might be a slightly different conversation, the council need to review everything with a fresh approach, because some time has passed since they originally looked at those sites. They have identified that they will look at their strategic sites assessment. They need to look at the SHELAR as well, both of which are evidence submitted to you, but perhaps new sites. There may be new sites that have come forward since those processes took place. But of course, things have changed in terms of planning permissions that have been granted. That's particularly relevant around Billingshurst, for example, where the landscape impacts of particular sites might have changed quite considerably, because planning permissions have been granted alongside their boundaries, and I think that's important to consider. But just perhaps a helpful point in relation to all the other matters we've discussed around 5-year housing land supply, resilience, windfall, and it just we've talked a lot about Mid-Sussex. Mid-Sussex have a permissive policy in their emerging plan. It's DPH2, which allows for sites sustainably located on the edges of existing settlement boundaries, either where it's allocated, but also where it's fewer than 10 dwellings, subject to policies in the rest of the plan. Just wondered whether that might be helpful for the council to consider in relation to increasing supply, certainly in the short term. Thank you.
So your 2 points, need to revisit sites whose context might have changed as a result of development. Secondly, potentially could have more relaxed policy relating to sites on the edge of urban areas. All right, we'll put that back to council in a minute. Ms. Piper.
Thank you, sir. I know this probably goes without saying, but I'm going to say it. In terms of reviewing, obviously the spatial strategy and the settlement hierarchy does need to be reconsidered. There are larger settlements on tier 2, for example, that because of previous large-scale allocations that are no longer going forward may have not been looked at fully. And obviously I'd encourage that as part of that process that I'm sure the council will be going through.
Thank you. Yes, Ms. Bearden.
Thank you, sir. It's just to draw on that point about revisiting the sustainability appraisal of the plan. There are a number of sites that were excluded specifically because of water neutrality, and that was very clear in the council's assessment of the site. So in a sense, there are quite a few easy wins in that regard, with the council's unfettered, I think that's the word they used, opinion that certain sites were suitable should water neutrality fall away. And the other point I raised, or started to raise yesterday, was about the infrastructure requirements. Obviously, that is a consideration, in terms of certainly strategic sites. And I think where a number of other speakers have said that it seems in the council's evidence that they're relying quite heavily on strategic sites. So again, it is helpful that the council have clarified the fact that they are looking at those smaller sites. The other thing is about, and I raised it yesterday, was about the support that growth can have on supporting infrastructure. So when we're talking about lower growth options and sustainable development, actually it doesn't mean that higher growth means unsustainable development. Ultimately, if larger sites, yes, they do provide a lot of infrastructure, but smaller sites can also contribute to that as well. The other thing is that when the council are talking around infrastructure, it goes back to that point around the successful nature of Horsham district in being able to deliver quite high levels of growth before water neutrality. And I would just like to make that point again, that water neutrality had absolutely nothing to do with infrastructure. That was about abstraction at a certain point. And I think, as I said yesterday, evidence has come to light since the issue has fallen away, that those abstraction levels were never an issue. So I would question, in terms of when we're talking about infrastructure delivery, obviously that is a consideration and that will be considered. But given the fact that the council were very successful in higher delivery rates before water neutrality, I suppose the question is, what's changed?
Well, we can put that to the council in a minute, but Mr. Churchill.
Yes, thank you, sir. I'm in a slightly odd situation in this examination, in so much as I'm representing an emission site, but an emission site that has planning permission and that is in the housing trajectory. Being an emission site, obviously, it isn't proposed for allocation in the plan, which we perceive to be a bit of an oddity, a bit of an own goal on behalf of the council, because clearly an allocation of a site with planning permission, it's been through that process of interrogation. It was approved at appeal, so the process of interrogation is up a notch on the interrogation process that's done for local plan making process, and it provides an opportunity to potentially increase confidence in the local plan making system. Obviously, having a site delivering housing in line with the local plan, as opposed to seemingly at odds with the local plan that doesn't have it allocated, it would seem to make sense in that context. It would also provide an opportunity for the council to potentially encourage greater delivery from a site that has planning permission, is proved as deliverable. And the reason for saying that is the circumstances around which planning permission were granted. Water neutrality has been mentioned a couple of times. That was on the table when that planning permission was granted. So there may well be an opportunity for the council to squeeze a little bit more out of sites such as this. So our recommendation would be that an allocation of the site would be a very sensible option. And just picking up on a point that was made slightly earlier about housing trajectory, we believe that there's an opportunity to be a little bit more optimistic about housing trajectory. Certainly the submissions that we made both at the appeal and subsequently to the team at the council has been a more optimistic approach for housing delivery, certainly than is listed in the appendix to the housing topic paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Churchill. Right, there's no more flags on. What I propose to do is to break and have some coffee, and then we'll give the council the opportunity of coming back on the points that have been made, which you've been taking copious notes of. So we'll adjourn now, and we'll come back at 10 to 12. Thank you. The hearing is resumed, and I'm going to go straight to the council and give them the opportunity of responding to some of the points that were raised this morning.
Sir, thank you very much. The first point I want to make is this on behalf of the council. We are fully aware of the parameters, the policy parameters of the MPPF when it comes to the selection of sites. And we're grateful also for the indications you have given in relation to factors such as landscape and other designations which may affect the scoring system, if I can put it that way, and the need to consider mitigation as a means of bringing those sites forward, for example. Fully aware of that, and I can assure you and those around me that the council is reviewing all its options in relation to sites which have become available. And it will do its best to meet any requirement you think it's appropriate to meet in due course. I will say this, the government has imposed a requirement on this and some other local authorities to start a new plan under the new system. And that starts this year. And given the likely requirement which will arise under that new system, we could be looking to find an additional 40% or more over existing requirement. I don't need to remind you, sir, of all people, that that would have quite serious implications for whatever spatial strategy is adopted at that point in time. So it's very important that we, as a local authority, are cognizant of the need to retain a degree of flexibility to accommodate that future need. And that need is going to have to be accommodated very early on because the planning process for the plan starts this year. So we need to maintain a degree of realism about what this plan is intended to achieve in the context of that duty, and particularly the long-term provision of housing in the context of the new planning system. So I just raise that now because they are matters which, in my submission, are material in determining the proper course of action for this plan. And very much will depend upon what options are available to the council in meeting any requirement that you believe is appropriate. So I just raise that now without in any way indicating where evidentially that's going to lead us. But it is important. So I'm not sure if there's anything else I need to respond to.
So I was just going to pick up on some of the points that you and others have raised around windfall supply that we've relied on in the trajectory. So I think firstly, it's important to say that we recognise the kind of inherent uncertainty around the supply of windfalls. We've tried to reflect that both in the topic paper that we published on the website, which is H09, and in the Matter 2 topic paper where we've covered our position on windfall. But we do think we've got good evidence of supply that's set out in that paper. In terms of the assessment of historic delivery that we've done, we have tried to take a worst case approach. So we've removed, so there were elements in that delivery where we lost appeals on sites, or we permitted sites because there was no 5-year housing land supply. All of those sites were removed from that initial assessment. We also had a large Sheila database at that point, so all those sites were removed. So in terms of the sites that fed into it, we took a precautionary approach there. The evidence that we ended up on had suggested somewhere in the region of 158 average per annum supply. We're proposing 120 per annum. And when we looked at the sort of mix of windfall versus other delivery, that was in the region of 15%. We're not proposing anywhere near that that mix. I think some of the hearing statements raised the fact that there's a sort of almost a drying up of sites or available sites, which again, we've tried to acknowledge that there's a sort of change and a fluctuation in sites that might be available. I think national policy certainly is moving in the direction of being more permissive in terms of sites. So there's an element of that which will feed into that supply. Also, you know, we've had 4-5 years of water neutrality, which will have prevented windfall sites coming forward. So there will be an element of pent up supply there. So that sort of forms the basis of our position on windfall. Okay.
I think from my point of view, picking up your point, Mr. Shadder-Even, that it is helpful to understand within the context of the new regulations and what the council's being required to do. It's quite useful to understand what the council's thinking is on this. Your point was we have to be realistic, reasonably flexible within this plan, because we have something coming down the tracks which is, you know, obviously of a different nature. So it would be quite useful to just expand that a little bit.
Yeah. The reason why the government's, one of the reasons why governments imposed this requirement is because it's cognizant of the fact that this and a few other plans are going through on the basis of an MTPF which has been superseded many times. And understands therefore that to bring forward planning up to date, there's a need for this authority and some others to embark upon the new system as quickly as possible. It's not intended as some kind of punishment, it's there for a reason. And in understanding that requirement, one has to speculate about what that's going to require in terms of numbers and the options available, the spatial options available to the council in meeting a new requirement, which will be considerably higher than this one. And without in any way predicting or providing you with any sort of particular direction of travel at this stage, because it's premature, it would be wrong of me to do that. Some of the options might include new settlements or a new settlement of a considerable order. And therefore, decisions made now should not, in some way, prejudice the range of options, spatial options open to the council in attempting to meet that need, which will arise, which will be set and which will have to be met in planning terms well in advance of the expiry of this plan period. So that's the point I'm making. Now, I do understand the tension this causes is considerable. And without knowing exactly what will happen, to know the extent to which that tension can be dealt with by way of compromise at this stage, and what compromises might be needed to be made at this stage in order for those options to remain available to the council. So I merely highlight that now. We will do our best to provide a solution to meet the requirement, having regard to the duty which would be imposed on this council to meet a much higher requirement, probably in the form of a substantial new settlement in the future.
That's a very helpful response. I'm just thinking of how we deal with that within the context of this plan. Is it material? We don't know yet, I suppose, whether it'll be material to your site selection process or the spatial strategy that you eventually light on. And I don't suppose you can say any more.
No, I can't say any more, because that work has to be done within a democratic context. That's the really important point about this. This plan is the council's plan. The site it brings forward is the point you've made before. It's the council's choice about which sites it brings forward to meet a requirement. So the question therefore is, if it's decided that we can meet that in a way which doesn't prejudice work being undertaken on the new plan, which starts this year, and that start will be made whilst this examination continues, we will then need to think about what devices are possible in policy terms for allocations, for example, in years 10 to 15 of this plan. So that's my thinking at the moment. I cannot be any more specific than that because I can't prejudge the outcome of the work this council is doing in lieu of any requirement you set. Now, I'm not suggesting the requirement should change. And Tunbridge Wells is a good example of this. The requirement remained the same over the whole of the plan period, but the actual plan delivered only 10 years worth with a requirement for an early review, because it was found that one of the principal strategic allocations wouldn't work because of delivery of infrastructure issues which came to light during the examination. So there are ways of dealing with this, but at the moment I don't want to speculate on any particular outcome. Just cognizant of the difficulties which we are facing because of the need to undertake this new plan.
Yes, I don't underestimate the task that the council are facing on this. I fully understand that, and depending on how far you get, it may be, you know, if there's an influence over ultimately the spatial strategy that you light on, you'll provide an explanation for that in due course. So I'm open to that, but we'll see where we go.
I'm flagging it now because it is potentially a matter of extreme importance.
Thank you very much. There aren't any other flags up, and I wasn't going to open the discussion up now. The council had a final say. What I was going to do was just very quickly run through some of the points that have come up this morning, and if I've missed any, please do tell me. The first thing was the council were going to liaise with Mid Sussex to look at the methodology that they have developed for assessing unmet need arising from the South Coast authorities. From that, you were going to develop a putative housing requirement. Also, although I think you're doing it already, a methodology for site selection, which, although you may have started that work, you haven't ruled out any particular routes to site selection. And that will include a critical assessment of work that's already been done. You're going to, once you've done that, or as part of that process, you're going to realistically assess delivery rates on a realistic basis from the sites that you've identified. And from that, we can start looking at recasting the requirement trajectory. There'll be the delivery trajectory, but that will inform the requirement trajectory as well, I think. Does that make sense? Yes. Yeah. Also from that process, you'll assess what will ultimately be the appropriate level of headroom. Are there any other points that came up that I've missed?
Not as far as we're concerned, sir.
All right. That is, we're moving towards the end of matter 2 now. I would say that I fully appreciate, I think everybody appreciates here that the discussion we've had has been to a degree, I wouldn't say theoretical, but it's been, we've been working in the ether a little bit because the figures are going to change. We don't know what's going to come out of the site selection process, and ultimately, therefore, we don't know what the delivery trajectory will look like. We don't even know what the overall housing supply figures are going to look like. But it's been a very helpful discussion from my point of view, and we can feed that into the discussion on the future programme of the work, which we're going to do on Friday. So I'm proposing to draw this hearing to a close, but before I do, is there anything else to be raised? Mr. Mackenzie, are you sure you need to? I want to close this.
Yes, yeah. So just to draw attention to, and it's really just to respond to the point that Mr. Shadarabian
I really don't know. I will stop you.
Oh, sorry.
I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Because the council has the right of final say.
Yes.
Right? So I'm just saying. So it's not, Mr. Mackenzie doesn't have the right of final say. The council does. Of
course, that's right.
So what were you going to say?
Just to be clear, I'm perfectly happy, of course, for the council to respond to this. It was just to flag, sir, that the letter to the chief executive of PINS, 9th of October 2025, deals with the point that Mr. Shadarabian alluded to, which was the need for an appropriate degree of pragmatism and flexibility to be adopted to the examination of these last so-called legacy plans. But it does emphasise that these plans are essential to facilitating the delivery of housing, and makes it clear that the government's expectation is still that they will significantly boost supply and need to meet housing need over the plan period. So the suggestion that it's any part of government policy that latitude given to this last set of legacy plans should be so wide as to effectively allow a deferral of important decisions to be made at an unknown point in the future. The new plan hasn't even begun to be prepared. I would suggest is not supported by that letter.
Mr. Shadarabian, do you want to respond?
The letter makes a legitimate requirement. It places no more of a requirement on us than was already placed in terms of meeting our need over the plan period. What I'm saying is we need to be cognizant about how we deal with the later stages of the plan, bearing in mind the need not to prejudice decision-making under the new system. As I said, if it comes to that, we will think about ways in which we can accommodate that. But I'm suggesting that you set the requirement for the plan period, and we'll try and work within that framework.
Well, I think that's right. We set the requirement for the plan period, but I don't think anybody's disputing that. How that's done and how you deal with things like the spatial strategy remain to be seen. We'll have to see where that goes. Yeah. All right.
I'm sorry. Can I just say we're not. This plan is not being examined in a vacuum. We have to be aware of the need to retain flexibility in order to accommodate further growth in due course. And that means making very rational decisions now, spatial decisions, which don't have that effect. And so it has to be left to us as the council to determine how best to deal with that in the context of the requirement.
I couldn't agree more. And if that, as long as it's adequately evidenced, then you will have a sound plan.
exactly.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. All right. I'm going to draw this to a close now. Thank you all very much for your help again. And I will look forward to seeing at least some of you tomorrow when we go to have discussion about housing for particular groups. So thank you all very much. Thanks for your participation.